G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Minor Prophets. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Okay, thank you for coming along to this session of the book of Zephaniah. Tonight, we're looking at chapter 1, verse 7 to chapter 3, verse 8. Now, and when we finished off the last session, we just finished off with the last 6 verses. Well, the first 6 verses of Zephaniah. We saw that Zephaniah, he prophesied in King Josiah's day in Judah, around about 640 to 610 BC. He was a member of the royal household. And at the time, there was a royal revival under Josiah after he followed King Manasseh. But we see that there's also still corruption of the royal house in spite of Josiah's reforms. The theme of Zephaniah is the day of Jehovah, and that's the most common name for the Great Tribulation. There's only 2 sections in this book. Section 1, which is chapter 1 to chapter 3, verse 8, describes the day of Jehovah. And then section 2, chapter 3, verse 9 to 20, describes the restoration of Israel. Now, what we see here is in this little book is that judgment is universal. God will utterly consume all things from off the face of the ground. But we also see before that there are warnings being given which demonstrate both the goodness and the severity of God. Now, with this judgment, we see the first purpose of the tribulation, which is to make an end of wickedness and the wicked ones. We see first that God's judgment against Judah because of their religious practices, that they were, even under Josiah, there was still some Baalism going on. There was star worshiping. There was this syncretism, which is where they combined religions into one. So what we had was we had them, for instance, they were worshiping Moloch and Jehovah at the same time, and that just doesn't cut it with God. So it was a time very much of spiritual indifference in Judah. So we're up to this section tonight, where we are looking at still with the judgment the judgment of Judah, and we're looking against their sin and social practices. Last time we looked at their religious practices. Now we're looking at the sin against and their social practices. We look at this in verses chapter 1, verse 7 to 13. We'll just read chapter 1, verse 7 to 10 first up, and we'll talk about that. This is chapter 1, verse 7. Hold thy peace at the presence of the Lord Jehovah, for the day of Jehovah is at hand. For Jehovah hath prepared a sacrifice. He hath consecrated his guests. And it shall come to pass in the day of Jehovah's sacrifice that I'll punish the princes and the king's sons and all such as are clothed with foreign apparel. And in that day I'll punish all those that leap over the threshold, that fill their master's house with violence and deceit. And in that day, says Jehovah, there shall be the noise of a cry from the fish gate, and a wailing from the second quarter, and a great crashing from the hills. So here in verse 7, we see the announcement of the coming of the day of Jehovah. And here he mentions for the first time the major theme of this book, which is the day of the Lord, the period of the Great Tribulation. So that gives us the timing in which these judgments are going to take place. So he announces to everybody, hold your peace at the presence of the Lord Jehovah, or be silent. Be quiet. Just shut up. And the reason is, for the day of Jehovah is at hand. It is near to come, and he points out it is going to be a time of sacrifice, in that Jehovah hath prepared a sacrifice. But this is not an animal sacrifice, but this is a sacrifice mentioned in Ezekiel 39, verse 17 onwards, and also mentioned in Revelation 19, in that there's going to be such a massive slaughter of sinners that the bodies become a sacrifice to the birds of the heavens, and the beasts of the field, as they eat the carcasses of those that are slain. It says he has consecrated his guests. Now, he also points out these guests have been sanctified, meaning they were actually set apart for this destruction. We see the judgment upon the royal house in verse 8. The timing here is, it shall come to pass when? In the day of Jehovah's sacrifice. So in the day when there is massive slaughter in the tribulation. That is also when members of the royal house shall be judged. Now he says, I'll punish the princes and the king's sons. And he mentions one of their sins, and that is the wearing of foreign apparel. Now, under the law of Moses, God had clearly regulated a dress code for Jews. And we can find that in Numbers 15, verse 38 to 39, and Deuteronomy 22, verse 11 to 12. And this clothing deals with distinctive Jewish garments. But now these Jewish garments are being ignored, and they're wearing foreign clothing. And what does that symbolize? Well, the wearing of foreign clothing means they're also mimicking foreign customs, something God told them not to do, and the royal house is especially guilty of this. The priesthood we see judged in verse 9, and the timing is, and in that day, same day as above, the period of the Great Tribulation. I'll punish all those that leap over the threshold. Now, leaping over the threshold can refer to either idolatrous practices or leaping over the wall for the purpose of spoiling. And most likely it's an idolatrous custom that he's referring to here, because he's talking about the priesthood. Whatever it refers to, it is done with violence and deceit as they fill their master's house with it. So that what we see here is that the priesthood was filling the house of God with violence and deceit. Priesthood was worshiping pagan deities within the temple compound, and for that reason, the judgment will also come. Now we see the commercial area of Jerusalem taken, and this is in verses 10 to 11. And Zephaniah puts this in the form of a taunting song. And the timing, again, it's and in that day, during the period of the Great Tribulation. He shows some geographical areas that will be affected by mentioning, for instance, the fish gate and the second quarter. There should be a cry from the fish gate and a wailing from the second quarter. And then on top of that, all that there will be a great crashing from the hills. So this was the industrial quarter of Jerusalem, and was once the home of a prophetess named Huldah, which we see mentioned in 2 Kings 22, verse 14. Verse 11 to verse 12, it says, Wail, you inhabitants of Maktesh, for all the people of Canaan are undone. All they that were laden with silver are cut off. It shall come to pass at that time that I will search Jerusalem with lamps, and I'll punish the men that are settled on their lees, that say in their heart, Jehovah will not do good, neither will he do evil. What's the Maktesh? Well, the Maktesh is another area of Jerusalem. It says, Wail, ye inhabitants of Maktesh. Maktesh is also known as the Tyropoeon Valley. Tyropoeon Valley. It's a valley that parallels the temple compound wall on its western side, and then borders the western part of the city of David. So this valley here separated the city of David from the lower city, leading up to the upper city, and this is the area that's being referred to here. And the reason he says is, for all the people of Canaan are undone. Now, the Hebrew word for Canaanite can also mean merchants, because that in the area we're talking about here, that was a merchant quarter. However, Israel by this time has become like the Canaanites in their business practices, and for that reason they are judged. It says, so all they that were laden with silver are cut off. So these are treated like businessmen with the Canaanites in their business practices, the way that the Canaanites would deal, the merchants. And then in verse 12, it says, it shall come to pass at that time, again, which time? In the time of the great tribulation, in the day of the Lord. Then he says, I will search with lamps. Now, there's a legend among the Greeks that there was a man named Diogenes of Sinope who went around holding a candle searching for an honest man. But in this case, the picture is the searching was done with lamps, and it's not to find an honest man, but it's to find the sinners so that nothing is hid. And in this way, the sinners are destroyed. And again, Zephaniah is picturing God carrying out the first purpose of the tribulation, which is the destruction of sin and sinners. It's to the first purpose of the tribulation is to make an end of wickedness and wicked ones. And you can find that in Isaiah chapter 13, verse 9, Isaiah 13:9, and Isaiah 24:19-20, Isaiah 24:19-20. He says here, I will punish the men that are settled on their lees. What's that? What's the lees? Well, the word lees refers to the solid matter that settles on the bottom of a cask or a wine area for making wine after fermentation. So after the grapes have been squeezed, either in the bottle or whatever they put it in, the animal skin, the solid matter goes to the bottom while the liquid stuff remains on top. And this is a thick part of the fermentation process. So they're pictured here as having remained too long on their lees. And the lees, when the liquid has been drained, the lees become very syrupy, very bitter, and very unpalatable. It's only good for throwing away. So what we see here is that he pictures Israel as having settled or sat too long on their lees, causing the whole wine to become syrupy and bitter. So Judah has settled down on its dregs and impurities, and instead of removing the dregs of pollution, they have become hardened and indifferent to God. And the result is that they linger over their dregs, over their lees, and having become drunk, they say in their hearts, Jehovah does neither good nor evil. Now that is a false theology, a saying about God which God will simply not tolerate. And their wealth shall become a spoil, and their houses desolation. Yes, they shall build houses, but shall not inhabit them, and they shall plant vineyards, but shall not drink the wine thereof. So the results of all these judgments we find here in verse 13. As far as their wealth, it's going to become a spoil for somebody else. As far as their houses, they'll become desolated. Their houses will become a devastation, and if they build new houses, they'll not enjoy living in them. Others will live in them instead. As for the crops, well, they'll plant vineyards, but others will enjoy them. So these are the threats which were also made by Amos in Amos 5:11. Similar thing. Now in verses 14 to 18, we see the description here. And we'll read these 5 verses. The great day of Jehovah is near. It is near and hasteth greatly. Even the voice of the day of Jehovah. The mighty man crieth there bitterly. That day is a day of wrath, a day of trouble and distress, a day of wasteness and desolation, a day of darkness and gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a day of the trumpet and alarm against the fortified cities and against the high battlements. And I will bring distress upon men that they shall walk like blind men because they have sinned against Jehovah. And their blood shall be poured out as dust and their flesh as dung. Neither their silver nor their gold shall be able to deliver them in the day of Jehovah's wrath. But the whole land shall be devoured by the fire of his jealousy, for he will make an end, yes, a terrible end, of all them that dwell in the land. Now, in these verses here, 14 to 18, chapter 1, Zephaniah gives us a very vivid description of the day of Jehovah. And he begins in verse 14 by describing the tribulation as the great day of Jehovah. And we have several descriptive terms here. It is Jehovah's day, which which is his day of judgment. It is soon to come, and the people of God are to live as though it might hit them any day now. It is a day of bitterness. It's a day when soldiers will shout. It's a day when God will finally move out in judgment. So it's also a day of bitterness again. And verse 15, he describes it as a day of special divine judgment. First of all, it's a day of God's wrath. It's a day of trouble and distress. It's a day of anguish, of trouble, of ruin, of darkness. It's gloominess with thick darkness. It's a day of clouds. It's a day of blackness. And this is a very detailed and negative description of what kind of time the Great Tribulation will be like. And verse 16 points out it's going to be a day of war. And he points this out in three ways. It's a day of the trumpet and alarm. When the trumpet sound calls, that's the warning of an invading army. A day of the battle cry as the battle begins. It's a day against the fortified cities. It's against the cities which have high towers to defend itself. It's indeed a day of war. In verse 17, he describes it as a day of judgment against sinners. The threat is God will bring distress against the people. Why? Because they have sinned against Jehovah. And the result of this sin is death. Their blood will be poured out like dust, and their entrails like filth or dung. And then finally, in verse 18, it is also a day of judgment against the land. So he points out here that they are beyond hope in that their wealth will not be able to save them in the day of Jehovah's wrath. And again, he spells out the threat, which is a land which will be devoured by fire. And the result is he will make a sudden end of all who live on the earth. Again, he's emphasizing here that the first purpose of the tribulation, which will be to make an end of wickedness and the wicked ones. Now we see the regathering of Israel preceding the day of Jehovah in chapter 2, verses 1 to 3. Gather yourselves together. Yes, gather together, O nation that hath no shame. Before the decree bring forth, before the day passes the chaff, before the fierce anger of Jehovah come upon you, before the day of Jehovah's anger come upon you. Seek ye Jehovah, all ye meek of the earth that have kept his ordinances. Seek righteousness, seek meekness. It may be you will be hid in the day of Jehovah's anger. Now, so far through chapter 1, he's been dealing with the Great Tribulation and the judgments that will occur during the Great Tribulation or the day of Jehovah. Now, what happens in chapter 2, verses 1 to 3 is that he describes an event that will take place before the tribulation starts, and that is the gathering of Israel preceding the day of Jehovah. And verse 1 begins with the command to gather, and he emphasized it by saying it twice. Gather yourselves together. Yes, gather together. So he's dealing here with the regathering of Israel prior to the tribulation. Now, when the Bible speaks of a worldwide regathering of Israel, remember, or I'm telling you now, if you don't know, there are two different types of worldwide regatherings. There are two worldwide regatherings. The first one is a worldwide regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment, and that is the judgment of the tribulation. The second regathering is a regathering in faith in preparation for blessing, and that is the blessings of the messianic or millennial kingdom. Now, in this passage here, he's dealing with the first regathering, which is the regathering in unbelief in preparation for the judgment of the day of Jehovah, the judgment of the Great Tribulation. So when he tells this nation to gather, he says, gather like a nation that has no shame. Now, when he talks about gathering, the Hebrew phrase he uses literally means gathered together like stubble. Gathered together like stubble in preparation for the burning judgment of the tribulation. The Hebrew word for nation is goy. G-O-Y, and that normally means Gentiles, though sometimes it is used of Israel. But here it has a special emphasis to point out that Israel has become like a Gentile nation that does not know God. Therefore, it's as a nation that hath no shame. So he's pointing out that this is a regathering in unbelief in preparation for judgment. In verse 2, he gives us the exact timing of this judgment. He says, first, it is before the decree bring forth or arrives. Which decree is the decree of verse 1. Gather together, is the decree of the Great Tribulation. It says, before the day passes the chaff, before the fierce anger of Jehovah come upon you, before the day of Jehovah's anger come upon you. In other words, we see all these four befores here. These before statements emphasize that this regathering takes place before the tribulation starts, and the reestablishment of Israel that occurred in 1948 was the fulfillment of this particular prophecy. The Jews were regathered back into the land, into a land which is nation of Israel. In verse 3, he has a message for the remnant. Of the remnant, he says, this is the believing remnant, seek ye Jehovah, all ye meek of the earth that have kept his ordinances. So these are the believing remnants. So the admonition here is addressed to these believing remnant. And the admonition here is to seek righteousness and seek meekness. So the faithful remnant is characterized by meekness and righteousness. Now, concerning the Jewish remnant that really does believe, the promise is that you may be hid in the day of Jehovah's anger, and that the Jewish remnant may be hid during the tribulation. And as we already know from our previous studies, they'll be hid in the city of Bozrah or Petra. Bozrah is Hebrew, Petra, Greek. Now here we have a play upon word, the word Zephaniah. Zephaniah means he whom Jehovah has hidden, and indeed the believing Jewish remnant will be hidden in the tribulation by the God of Israel. And that is why the remnant is going to survive. So what is done so far is to deal with the Great Tribulation judgment as it's going to affect Israel. And he's pointing out that sometime before the tribulation comes, Israel will gather together into the land. Currently, Israel are in the land in unbelief. Also in verse 3, where he speaks about seeking meekness and seeking righteousness, to seek Jehovah is to seek righteousness. To seek his righteousness proves that one has meekness. And the Hebrew word for seek here, which is bakash, means not merely to seek, but to seek and to become rightly related to God. That's what they're encouraged to do. And the word is used in this way in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 29, and Psalm 27, verse 4. So we see here that the righteous remnant are hidden in Bozrah, and you can find that in Isaiah 33, 14 to 16, and chapter 65 of Isaiah, and also Micah 2:12. Now we see the judgment upon the Gentile nations, and we find this in chapter 2, verses 4 to 15. The point he's trying to make, or the point he's making here, is basically that if God punished these other nations in the past, he will surely judge them and punish Israel, especially in the future. And he picks four nations, which he does deliberately because they're in the four different directions. And he points out Israel's enemies, west, east, north, and south, are going to be punished. And he begins with Philistia, which is west of Judah, in verses 4 to 7. For Gaza shall be forsaken, and Ashkelon a desolation. They shall drive out Ashdod at noonday, and Ekron shall be rooted up. Now, that's verse 4. Now, the land of Philistia, the Philistines did not have one national king like the others, but there was a nation of the Philistines, which was a combination of 5 key cities known as the cities of the Pentapolis. And each city had its own king. And three of these cities were on the sea coast, running from north to south. We have Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza. And in working inland north to south, it was Ekron and Gath. In this passage, he mentions 4 of the 5 Philistine cities. He mentions Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron. Only Gath is not mentioned in this account, probably because it ceased to be a city under King Uzziah. Also, it's these other 4 nations are north, south, east, and west. As for Gaza, Gaza would be forsaken. As for Ashkelon, in verse 4, she's to become a desolation. Now, there's some wordplay in the Hebrew text where he says Gaza is forsaken. He uses a word that is similar to the Hebrew word for Gaza, and it literally it reads Aza Azuba, or transliterated, Gaza has been gazazed. Ashkelon becomes a desolation, and here again is a play upon words because the word Ashkelon in Hebrew means a fruitful city. So he says Ashkelon, Samama, and that means the fruitful city will prove to be fruitless. As for Ashdod, they'll be driven away at noonday. Now, normally at noon, the armies rest because it's too hot. But in this case, in the noonday, it'll be taken in the heat of battle. And the name Ashdod means fortress or a fortress town. And here he says, fortress town will be no fortress. And then we have Ekron, she'll be rooted up. And again, he plays upon the meaning of Ekron. Hebrew Ekron is Ekron, is Ekron, and to root up is Tika, same root word. So Ekron town is going to be rooted up. Root town will be rooted up. In verse 5, woe unto the inhabitants of the sea coast, the nation of the Kerethites. The word of Jehovah is against you, O Canaan, the land of the Philistines. I will destroy thee, that there shall be no inhabitants. And the sea coast shall be pastures, with cottages for shepherds and folds for flocks. And the coast shall be for the remnant of the house of Judah. They shall feed their flocks thereupon. In the houses of Ashkelon shall they lie down in the evening. For Jehovah their God will visit them and bring back their captivity. So the judgment of God will be so severe that in verse 5, the Philistine population is going to totally disappear. And he begins his declaration, woe unto the inhabitants of the sea coast. Why? Because the Philistines live in the Philistine plain, which is the flat plain in the southern part of the land of Israel. And he says, the nation, the Kerethites, will be no more. Philistines were also known as the Kerethites because originally they came to the land of Israel from the island of Capthor, therefore the Cherethites, and Capthor is also known as Crete. So they're Cretans. This point was also made in Amos 9, verse 7. Then he said, the word of Jehovah is against you. That means it's against Canaan and against the land of the Philistines. And the judgment is, I will destroy thee. And the result is that there shall be no inhabitant. Now, this prophecy has now been fulfilled, and today there are no Philistines left anywhere in this known world. And in verse 6, he points out the coastland where the Philistines live is to become pasture land with cottages for shepherds and folds for flocks. So, and then in verse 7, the area is to become the possession of the population of Judah. In other words, the Jews will inhabit their territories. So he says, the coast shall be for the remnant of the house of Judah. The remnant is going to inherit it, and they shall feed their flocks thereupon. In the houses of Ashkelon shall they lie down in the evening. Now today, Ashkelon is a Jewish city, but this has only been that way since 1948. But here he's not dealing with the present restoration, but in the distant future at a time of the final restoration of the land of Israel. When he says, for Jehovah their God will visit them and bring back their captivity, there's going to be a time when all of the land will be a Jewish possession, including Ashkelon and all the other cities of the Philistines. Now we go to Moab and Ammon, which is in the east. And this we find in chapter 2, verse 8 to 11. I've heard the reproach of Moab and the revilings of the children of Ammon, wherewith they have reproached my people and magnified themselves against their border. Therefore, as I live, says Jehovah of hosts, God of Israel, surely Moab shall be as Sodom and the children of Ammon as Gomorrah, a possession of nettles and salt pits and a perpetual desolation. The residue of my people shall make a prey of them, and the remnant of my nation shall inherit them. This shall they have for their pride, because they have reproached and magnified themselves against the people of Jehovah of hosts. Now Jehovah will be terrible unto them, for he will famish all the gods of the earth, and men shall worship him, every one from his place, even all the isles of the nations. So in these verses 8 to 11, he deals now with Moab and Ammon, which are east of Israel, and their sin is spelled out in verse 8. Both Moab and Ammon are the descendants of the two sons of Lot, which he produced by his two daughters, and you can find it in Genesis 19, verse 30 to 38. But their sin is, first of all, they reproached the Jews. They have reproached my people, God's people Israel. And God says he has heard the reproach of Moab and the revilings of the children of Ammon against his people. Secondly, they're also guilty of taking Jewish territory, for he says they magnified themselves against their border, which is against Jewish territory. So they took Jewish territory. Now, in comparison, he looks at their future with Sodom and Gomorrah, verse 9. And the declaration is, therefore, as I live, says Jehovah of hosts, God of Israel, surely Moab shall be as Sodom, and the children of Ammon as Gomorrah. Now, the two sons of Lot, Moab and Ammon, were brought out of the sin of Sodom and Gomorrah, and now they'll die like Sodom and Gomorrah. And the land then becomes a possession of nettles, a place of wild animals. It became a land of salt pits, and just as Sodom became, like the salt pits at the south end of the Dead Sea, and are destined to be a desolation. On the other hand, their territory is to be inhabited by the remnant of my people, being the Jewish people, so that the residue of my people shall make a prey of them, and the remnant of my people shall inherit them. In verse 10, he states what their sin was, and that was anti-Semitism. This shall they have for their pride. And what they will have for their pride is a judgment like that of Sodom and Gomorrah. Why? Because they have reproached and magnified themselves against the people of Jehovah of hosts, which is the Jewish people. And again, he emphasizes here that Israel, even in their state of unbelief, is still the people of Jehovah, still the people of God. And in verse 11, God spells out his purpose for the judgment. Jehovah will be terrible unto them for two reasons. First, to show that he alone is God, for he will famish all the gods of the earth. No other gods left. And second, to cause men to worship God. Men shall worship him, everyone from his place, even all the isles of the nations. So as a result of these judgments, we know from Jeremiah's passages that there will be both Ammonites and Moabites will come to saving faith, and so there will be a nation of Moab and Ammon in the kingdom, and both will be under the authority of Israel. Now we have Ethiopia to the south in Zephaniah 2:12. He says, you Ethiopians also, you shall be slain by my sword. Now the Cushites, or the Ethiopians, descendants of Cush, son of Ham, he doesn't give any more detail regarding Ethiopia as he does with the others. He just says they're going to be slain by the sword. He simply probably wanted to include Ethiopia to give an example of someone who's in the south of Israel. He doesn't give any more details here. And then the final one is Assyria, which is to the north in verses 13 to 15. And he will stretch out his hand against the north and destroy Assyria, and will make Nineveh a desolation and dry like the wilderness. And in verse 13, he makes the announcement of judgment, and he'll stretch out his hand against the north. Now, the last geographical direction he's dealing with, and he will destroy Assyria. He'll make Nineveh, which was the capital of Assyria, a desolation and dry like the wilderness. In verse 14, he emphasizes her future desolation. He says, the herds shall lie down in the midst of her, all the beasts of the nations, both the pelican and the porcupine shall lodge in the capitals thereof. Their voice shall sing in the windows, desolation shall be in the thresholds. Why? Because he's going to expose all the cedar works here, which is what's under the more elaborate walls and ceiling coverings. So everything's going to be exposed to the elements. So the image that emerges here is one of depopulation, destruction, and ruin. In verse 15, it is Assyria that will suffer mockery in the future. She was guilty of mocking the God of Israel in Isaiah 36, 13-20. Now God is going to mock her. He says, this is the joyous city that dwelt carelessly, that said in her heart, I am, and there is none besides me. How has she become a desolation? A place for beasts to lie down in. Everyone that passeth by her shall hiss and wag his hand. Now we come to the judgment of Jerusalem in chapter 3, verses 1-7, the day of judgment here. Woe to her that is rebellious and polluted. Previously it was Judah, now it's Jerusalem. Woe to her that is rebellious and polluted, to the oppressing city. She obeyed not the voice, she received not correction, she trusted not in Jehovah. She drew not near to her God. Her princes in the midst of her are roaring lions. Her judges are evening wolves. They leave nothing till the morrow. Her prophets are light and treacherous persons. Her priests have profaned the sanctuary. They have done violence to the law. So here, as he turns to Jerusalem, he begins with the word woe. So verse 1 emphasizes the woe concept. The concept of woe actually involves two emotions here. First up, it's a warning of doom. And secondly, it includes the regret that the time of judgment has come that was necessary. Now, the reason for the woe is because of the status that Jerusalem has come to. And he mentions three things here. Rebelliousness. Rebelliousness against what? Against the law of Moses. Polluted. Both of these words have sexual connotations, pointing out that her spiritual adultery disqualified her from performing any sacred duties. Oppressing. She has become an oppressing city, specifically forbidden in the law of Moses. And to explain what further we see in verse 2, he now enumerates her four sins. She obeyed not the voice, and that's the voice of the prophets. She received not correction. She didn't learn from previous disciplinary judgments. She just kept on going. She trusted not in Jehovah, no faith in Jehovah at all. She did not draw near to her God. There was no true worship. There was no true worship of God because she did not have any faith in God. And the reason these four sins were true of Jerusalem is because in verse 3 and 4, her false leaders, and he mentions four classes of leaders. Princes, in the midst of her are roaring lions, meaning they're destroying the city rather than ruling it and providing peace and prosperity. Judges are evening wolves, leaving nothing for tomorrow. They're guilty of preying upon the city. And then we have the prophets in verse 4. They're light and treacherous persons. They're light because they're false prophets, and they're treacherous because they're leading people astray with those false prophecies. Priests, they're guilty of profaning the sanctuaries. That's plural, that's both. For both the holy place and the holy of holies, and defiling the entire temple compound. And secondly, they're guilty of doing violence to the law. They who were assigned to be the teacher of the law now do violence to it. In verse 5, in contrast to the status of Jerusalem, the status of her four groups of leaders, God is righteous. Jehovah in the midst of her is righteous. He will not do iniquity. Every morning doth he bring his justice to light. He fails not, but the unjust knows no shame. So he declares Jehovah is in the midst of her righteous. He has no sin, and he will not do iniquity. Instead, what he does is he brings justice without fail morning by morning. And this is in contrast with the unjust who know no shame. In verses 6 to 7, he spells out God's warning. I have cut off the nations. Their battlements are desolate. I have made their streets waste so that none passes by. Their cities are destroyed so that there is no man, so that there is no inhabitant. I said, only fear thou me, receive correction, so her dwelling shall not be cut off, according to all that I have appointed concerning her. But they rose early and corrupted all their doings. So in verse 6, the prophet points out that the destruction of the nations he dealt with in chapter 2 was meant to serve as a warning to Israel. He declares, I have cut off the nations, their battlements are desolate, I have made their streets waste so that none passes by. Their cities are destroyed so that there is no man, so that there is no inhabitant. They can see what God has done to these nations. They have seen the results of God's destructions. But instead of learning from God's judgments upon the nations, they have chosen to do otherwise, and they have become as guilty as these Gentile nations. And verse 7 gives Israel's response. If they received the God's correction, they would not have suffered destruction. So God said, only fear thou me, receive correction. That was the appeal that God made through their prophets. They were to fear God only and receive his instruction and his correction for the reason, so her dwelling shall not be cut off according to all that I have appointed concerning her. It's all they had to do. Fear God and receive correction, change their ways. But Jerusalem's response was only to do more corruption still. And so he declares, but they rose early and corrupted all their doings. They get up early in the morning just for the sake of doing evil things. So Jerusalem has become of equal guilt with the Gentile nations, and more so, and that is why the judgment of Jerusalem shall come. In Zephaniah 3:8, we see the judgment of all nations. Therefore, wait ye for me, says Jehovah, until the day that I rise up to the prey. For my determination is to gather the nations, that I may assemble the kingdoms, to pour upon them mine indignation, even all my fierce anger. So in verse 8 here, he declares his judgment of all the nations. And basically, he summarizes the campaign of Armageddon. He starts out with a message to the remnant. Therefore, wait ye for me until the day that I rise up to the prey. So as for the remnant, they are to remain in hiding and to wait for God until he rises up for the prey, which will occur at the second coming. So until God moves into the final judgment of the tribulation, especially in the campaign of Armageddon, they are to wait upon him. And then he says, after he gathers all the nations against Israel, he will destroy them. He says, for my determination is to gather all the nations, that I may assemble the kingdoms. And the purpose of this assembling of the nations and the kingdom is, first of all, to pour upon them mine indignation, even all my fierce anger. And secondly, for all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy. Again, this is part of his program to carry out the destruction of the wickedness and the wicked ones. All these things will be the sign of Israel's final regathering. It is a sign that will mark Israel's final restoration. So basically what we see here in this one verse is a summary of the entire campaign of Armageddon. And elsewhere, we will see all these nations coming together against Jerusalem when we come to Zechariah chapters 12 and 14. And that's a lot for tonight. Study hard and grow strong.